Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Let me introduce myself. My name is Professor Michael Arthur, and I have the privilege and the honour of being the President and Provost of UCL. So it's my very, very great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to this annual Lancet Lecture. The Lancet Lecture is a collaboration between one of the world's leading health journals, The Lancet, and one of the world's leading multi-faculty universities, UCL. And it fits for us in the context of our interest in tackling the big global problems that the world is facing, which we do through our interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary research activities called the Grand Challenges. And those Grand Challenges cover four main areas. Of relevance to tonight is global health, but we are also interested in human well-being, in intercultural interaction, and the fourth one is actually in sustainable cities. I think this Lancet Lecture has fast become one of the most prominent lectures that UCL stages each year, and obviously in this case jointly with the Lancet. The lecture is now in its 14th year, which is absolutely fantastic. We are very, very grateful to the Lancet for co-sponsoring the evening. The intention of this lecture is to be absolutely agenda setting and to set out the key issues at stake in global health and in that context to provide a rallying cry for action. When you look at the list of past speakers, it is really quite remarkable. And these have been individuals of the highest academic, intellectual, and political caliber. It includes two Nobel laureates, Professor Daniel Kahneman and Amartya Sen. Other speakers have included Michelle Sidibe, the Executive Director of UN AIDS, Professor Lord Robert May, former government chief science advisor and former president of the Royal Society. We've also had the Norwegian Prime Minister, Jens Stoltenberg, and last year we had an absolutely superb and memorable lecturer from Dr. Agnes Bingawayo, the Minister of Health for the Republic of Rwanda. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this lecture. I would now like to invite Dr. Richard Horton, the editor of The Lancet, to say a few words and to introduce our speaker. Richard. You're on.
Welcome. Tonight, we welcome Arundhati Roy, who is going to speak on the subject of the half-life of caste, the ill health of a nation. But you are asking, who is Arundhati Roy? That's why you're here. Good question. But I've done a systematic review of all the available biographies, none of which have been peer-reviewed. We were peer-reviewing them just down there on the front row. So here goes. Arundhati's birthday is on November the 24th, so happy birthday for next Monday. She was born in Shillong, the capital of Meghalaya, one of the smallest states in India, and this is what I could find out. Susanna Arundhati Roy is the daughter of a Keralite Christian mother, of Syrian descent, and a Bengali Hindu father. She grew up in Kerala, attending a boarding school. She went on to be a student of architecture in Delhi, an education that, she has said, had an important effect on the construction of her writing. She's been an actor, a screenwriter, a film critic. She's been a brave and outspoken commentator and chronicler on India's nuclear testing, its dams, its corrupt corporations, its mining industry, and even on the very essence of India itself. Her scope is global, with trenchant writing about war and the consequences of globalization. And she's been sentenced and served at least one day in prison. Just this year, she provoked outrage by criticizing Gandhi for his discrimination. For her work, she's been awarded many prizes and honors, including the Lannan Foundation's Culture of Freedom Award in 2002, the Sydney Peace Prize in 2004, and the Norman Mailer Prize for Distinguished Writing in 2011. But for those thinking of bestowing an award on Arundhati Roy, be careful. She has turned down at least one prize in her life because of who was doing the bestowing. And of course, how could I introduce her without saying that she's a Booker Prize-winning novelist? Her 1997 book, The God of Small Things, has sold well over 6 million copies, rather more, I have to admit, than the circulation of a certain journal I work for. And she is with us this evening at a moment when India, if one listens to its politicians, seems to have entered an entirely new era. Yesterday, on a visit to Fiji, the Times of India reported that India's new Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who won his landslide election victory only in May this year, said that India intended to play the part of, his word, teacher to the world. India, Prime Minister Modi said, would use the strength of its democracy and its demographic dividend, its young population, to benefit humankind. In a world that was now living in an age of knowledge, he went on, India has an especially important part to play. Now, to outsiders like myself, this seems a very hopeful message. So Prime Minister Modi, if he was here, and he's very welcome, might raise an eyebrow this evening if he was indeed with us. A discussion about the ill health of a nation sits perhaps in some discomfort next to his proposition that India is poised to offer solutions to a world that he says needs India's energy and innovation. But I think Arundhati Roy would welcome this discomfort. The titles of her essays and books signify her intent. The End of Imagination, The Greater Common Good, The Algebra of Infinite Justice, War Talk, The Shape of the Beast, Broken Republic, or Field Notes on Democracy. She once said, each time I step out, I hear the snicker-snack of knives being sharpened, but that's good. It keeps me sharp. Arundhati Roy, we are delighted you accepted our invitation to join us this evening. You are our very welcome guest. Please give your warm appreciation for Arundhati Roy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. See, I think I might have pulled off a little scam here by this title, which makes the lecture sound more medical than it's going to be. But obviously, I'm using the word ill health, the term ill health, in a much broader way than just clinically or medically, because I'm not going to be just talking about the fact that vulnerable populations in societies that are becoming increasingly unfair and unjust are obviously vulnerable to crises of public health and epidemics and malnutrition and so on. But I'm going to be talking about a social practice in India which just embraces and institutionalizes injustice, which valorizes it and even bestows religious sanction on it. India produces, as everybody knows, even people who watch movies, hundreds of thousands of doctors. But you still have we still a society where a public health worker will refuse to touch a child who's ill because they are untouchable. You go to many hospitals, especially government hospitals, you see doctors who refuse to do a post-mortem because it's polluting to touch the corpse. So they will get the hospital sweepers who belong to the Dalit caste to actually, touch the corpse, and they'll remote control the post-mortem. So this is the society that we live in still. So this lecture is based on an essay of mine that was published earlier this year called The Doctor and the Saint. And it is, I'm going to try and tell the story of caste in India by kind of outlining the conflict between two men, one of whom you have heard of, all of you have heard of, and the other perhaps many of you have never heard of. So the doctor is Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, who people call Baba Sahab, and who is revered and loved almost like a deity by millions of Indians, particularly Dalits, who used to be called untouchables. And the saint, and I use this term ironically, as the saint of the status quo, is Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, the man most of you know as Mahatma Gandhi, the great soul. Now, some of the things I'm going to say and read to you, particularly, living in India, I didn't have the nerve really to put in a lot of analysis. Most of what I have to say are direct quotations from the speeches and writing of Mahatma Gandhi. They are not analysis, they are not inferences. And I followed these writings from 1893, which is when he arrives in South Africa, to 1948, which is really the end of his life. And if these things shock and disturb you, all I can say is that they shocked and disturbed me too, because I too grew up with this conditioning, unquestioning and just accepting what we were taught. So, it was a tremendous shock to learn what I learned. So Ambedkar was Gandhi's most erudite and formidable adversary. And he challenged him not just sorry, I'm just going to put on this timer. And he challenged him not just politically and intellectually, but also morally. And the conflict between these two men, of course, unfolded at the heart of India's national movement. And it actually complicates and deepens our understanding of what imperialism means. Very often, the mainstream narrative of the freedom movement leaves Ambedkar out of the story, or it just valorizes him as the leader of the untouchables, just ghettoizes him, or as the writer in the Indian Constitution, but it leaves out the passion that drove him. And I suppose of all the hundreds of hagiographies of Gandhi as the single hand, the person who with a spinning wheel and armed with the spinning wheel and truth undid the British Empire, perhaps the most well-known one is Sir Richard Attenborough's film, Gandhi, which won many Oscars and which is the sort of ordinary person's guide to India's national movement. Personally, I would like a notice to go up in front of that film saying this is a work of fiction. And I would even better like that film to be remade with Sir Ben Kingsley playing this new version of Gandhi, the Gandhi that's been hidden in plain sight, a very, very disturbing version of Gandhi. Maybe he'll get another Oscar, who knows. But before I get into the minutiae of this debate, I just want to, I'm sure many of you don't really know in detail what caste is. So I just want to explain it to you very briefly. Anthropologists will debate the origins of caste for years to come, but its organizing principles, which is based on a hierarchical sliding scale of entitlements and duty, of purity and pollution, and the ways in which they were and are policed and enforced, are not all that hard to understand. The people at the top of the caste pyramid, the Brahmins, are considered pure and have plenty of entitlements, and those at the bottom are considered polluted and have few entitlements but plenty of duties. And this pollution-purity matrix is correlated to an elaborate system of caste-based ancestral occupation. So what we call the caste system today is known in Hinduism's founding texts as the Varnashram Dharma, or the Chatur Varna, the system of 4 Varnas. And these 4 Varnas, which is the Brahmin, who's the priest, the Kshatriya, the soldier, the Vaishya, the trader, and the Shudra, which is the service provider, if you like. These 4 broad categories are then divided into something like 4,000 endogamous subcastes, jatis they're called. And outside of the jatis are the Ati Shudras, who are the Dalits, the outside of caste, the untouchables, who are also divided into many, many different categories. So the outside of the Varnas are the Ati Shudra, the subhumans, arranged in hierarchies of their own, the untouchables, the unseeables, the unapproachables, whose presence, whose touch, whose very shadow is considered to be polluting by privileged caste Hindus. Each region of India has lovingly perfected its own unique version of caste-based cruelty based on an unwritten code that is in many ways even worse than the dehumanizing Jim Crow laws. Other than being forced to live in segregated settlements, untouchables were not allowed to use the public roads that privileged castes used. They were not allowed to drink from common wells. They were not allowed into Hindu temples. They were not allowed into privileged caste schools. They were not permitted to cover their upper bodies, and they were only allowed to wear certain kinds of clothes and certain kinds of jewelry. Some castes, like the Mahars, the caste to which Baba Saheb Ambedkar belonged, had to tie brooms to their waist that would sweep away their polluting footprints and hang spittoons around their necks to collect their polluted saliva. Men of the privileged caste had undisputed rights of the bodies of untouchable women. So love is polluting, but rape is pure. In many parts of India, in particular in the state of Gujarat, where Gandhi as well as Modi come from, both of whom belong to the Baniya caste, the Vaishyas, Baniya, the trader caste. All this continues even to this day. What remains to be said about an imagination, human or divine, that has thought up a social arrangement such as this? And here I quote Ambedkar, who said, "There cannot be a more degrading system of social organization than the caste system. It is a system that deadens, paralyzes, and cripples people from helpful activity." But the most famous Indian in the world, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, disagreed. He believed that caste represented the genius of Hindu society. In 1921, he wrote, and I quote, "I believe that if Hindu society has been able to stand, it is because it is founded on the caste system. To destroy the caste system and adopt the Western European social system means that Hindus must give up the principle of hereditary occupation, which is the soul of the caste system. The hereditary principle is an eternal principle. To change it is to create disorder. I have no use for a Brahmin if I cannot call him a Brahmin for my life. It will be chaos if every day a Brahmin is changed into a Shudra, and a Shudra is to be changed into a Brahmin." So people say that Gandhi, was an incrementalist, that he changed his point of view. He never ever renounced the system of Varnas. He always believed in the idea of ancestral occupations. Sometimes he said that the 4,000 subcastes should be, just made into 4 Varnas. And what he did do, along with many people on the Hindu right, including the RSS and people like Modi, is that they campaigned against untouchability, which is the performative and ritual end of caste. And I'll come to that in some detail as to why it was important for them to campaign against untouchability and yet believe in the structures of caste. So how is it that, other contemporary abominations like apartheid or sexism and racism and imperialism and religious fundamentalism, these things are discussed, may not be defeated, but they're certainly discussed, whereas caste is something that's just been invisibilized by everybody. And why should that be? How is it that it has just passed underneath the radar? How has it managed to escape scrutiny? And how is it that one of its most ardent supporters has come to be seen as a saint of the modern world, a sort of modern-day Christ? Maybe because caste is associated with Hinduism, mysticism, yoga, the Beatles, vegetarianism, things that are seen as kind and good and hippie and so on. And maybe because, unlike, say, apartheid or race, caste was never color-coded. It's not formally color-coded, so it's not even easy for outsiders to see. And even today in India, caste has very many buoyant admirers, many of them Gandhians, who believe it's a sort of social glue that helps Indian society to survive, as Gandhi said. Caste is not the same as race, but casteism and racism are both forms of discrimination that target people because of their descent. And supporting caste is like supporting racism or supporting apartheid. And the other reason that caste has managed to pass under the radar is because many progressive intellectuals in India, particularly left-leaning intellectuals, have been unable to deal with the idea of caste because it just doesn't fit into the Marxist, the reductive Marxist framework. So they can say caste is class or something, but caste is really the engine that drives Indian society. So you cannot ignore it. And yet, this erasure, this project of unseeing is sometimes a conscious political act by progressive intellectuals, and sometimes comes from a place of such rarefied privilege that caste has not been stumbled upon, not even in the dark, and is presumed to have been eradicated like smallpox. Now, actually, the opposite is true. I could actually spend this entire lecture giving you the facts and figures of contemporary caste and how it's practiced. I'm just going to whiz through that part because you can read it. I don't want to just throw numbers at you. But in contemporary India, caste has actually been entrenched and modernized. A recent survey tells you that less than 5% of marriages in India are across caste. And within those marriages, even if you live in a city like Delhi, you will read almost every day about families beheading their own children for marrying, across caste. India's free market-friendly democracy, in which 100 people own more wealth than 25% of the GDP, has entrenched and modernized caste. The trading caste, that's Gandhi's caste, the Baniya caste, who's just less than 2% of the population, actually controls the economy, big business as well as small. So if you look at the big corporations, whether it's Reliance, whether it's Mittals, whether it's Sanghvis, the Ruya brothers, Birlas, Jindals, Adanis, Mittals, they are all Baniyas. They all belong to this trading caste. So it's really fascinating. People say, India and China are economic giants, but the Indian economy is controlled by Baniyas, who are not manufacturers. They are traders. So they are, so the Indian economy is a very extractive one, where people are trying to sell what they don't have to buy, minerals from under the forest floor and things like that, So it has a lot to do with caste, also the character of the economy. Now, those are the big corporations. And then at the bottom, you have almost all of India the small farmers, the Adivasis, the tribal people caught in rural debt. Those are also mostly Baniyas, Marwadis, who control the small economy as well. Now, so you have the corporations, and then you have the media. And if you look at the media, who owns the media? You look at the Times of India, the big, let's say the big newspapers, Times of India, Hindustan Times, Times Now, Indian Express, The Hindu, all owned by other Brahmins or Baniyas. Dainik Jagran, which has a circulation of 55 million, Hindi newspaper. Dainik Bhaskar, perhaps the most influential Hindi daily with a 17.5 million circulation, again owned by Baniyas. Mukesh Ambani of Reliance owns 27 national news channels. So you see the control, the economy and the media. And who runs the media? Studies have shown, again, it's dominated by Brahmins, basically. And who are only less than 5% of the population. Baniyas are 2% of the population, but they control the entire economy. The Brahmins run the judiciary, the bureaucracy, the academia, publishing, journalists. You will not find a Dalit journalist in mainstream media. Meanwhile, the Dalits are 90% of them landless. You know, all the debates on caste about affirmative action in India, where you had privileged caste people immolating themselves, talking about merit, saying there should not be affirmative action. But only 2% of Dalits are even eligible for affirmative action because of the educational qualifications. You know, so all the oxygen on the debates on caste is taken up with this, when it actually only applies to 2% of the Dalit population. But the only place where you will find 90% of the people employed are Dalits are in the municipalities, the sweepers, the cleaners. These still continue to be Dalits. You all must have heard of the Delhi gang rape and murder that took place in 2012. Huge protests, the whole world was outraged. Nobody thought that same year 1,500 Dalit women were raped by touchable men. It doesn't matter, it doesn't count, it's not in the radar. 651 Dalits were lynched and killed in 2012. You know, just last month, you had 3 people being hacked to death and their limbs being scattered across fields and pushed into wells. But you know, since India is now open for business, these things don't really matter, do they? For the untouchables, Ambedkar said, Hinduism is a chamber of horrors. So the Doctor and the Saint is actually an introduction written to the annotated edition of Annihilation of Caste, which was a text Ambedkar wrote in 1936. He was invited to speak at a sort of Hindu reformist conference in Lahore. And when they asked him for this text in advance, and when they read that he was planning to use the platform to denounce Hinduism and to tell Dalit people to convert to any other religion, to escape the stigma of caste, they disinvited him. So he published the text himself. It was, it remains a sort of underground classic because it's still not available in bookshops, this text, this incredible, liberating, furious text. But who took it upon himself to reply to Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste but Mahatma Gandhi? So when I started, reading this debate, I began to sort of follow the thread of the debate on caste and the things Gandhi had said about caste backwards into, the time he arrived in South Africa. And what I discovered was something so deeply disturbing. I have been criticized a lot for talking about Gandhi so much when I'm introducing a text of Ambedkar. But I believe that unless you dismantle this absolutely false myth that has been placed before us, we're never going to be able to apply our minds to what is really going on here. So often this debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar is seen as a debate between tradition and modernity. Gandhi, in a way, was prophetic in his understanding of the cataclysm of modernity. So he looks back to this mythic past where he says everything was so wonderful. And just like Modi is saying, in 1909, Gandhi in Hind Swaraj says, nobody can teach India anything. It is the mother of all civilizations, and so on. And Ambedkar, so disgusted with the past, embraced Western liberalism as a way out of the morass of this kind of injustice, and he failed to see the seed of cataclysm in that. So it's a complicated debate that took place, but what we need to do is not to pick this utopia or that, but look at the impetus that drove those utopias. So Ambedkar was the heir to an old tradition of anti-caste intellectuals that began with Buddhism. Of course, I could go through the names of all those intellectuals and poets that were part of that tradition, but I just want to read out a laundry list to you. But he inherited the mantle of Kabir and Ravidas and Tukaram, most importantly Jyotiba Phule, an incredible man who few people have heard of outside of India, in fact, even outside of the Dalit community. But Gandhi, too, was an inheritor of a tradition of privileged caste reformers who, at that time, had begun to campaign against untouchability because there was a big panic, and I'll explain to you why, about the fact that previously, for centuries before that, untouchable people had been converting in their millions to Islam, to Christianity, to Sikhism, to escape the stigma of caste. But then, at the turn of the century, between the 19th century and the 20th century, suddenly the idea of empire turned into the idea of the nation state with all its politics of representation. It wasn't enough for you to ride a horse to Delhi and say, you are the emperor now. So then the whole question of demography became important. Who represents whom? The Sikhs, the Muslims, the untouchable, the upper caste, the farmer. Who represents these people? Who has the right to claim that they represent? And the untouchable population at the time was something like 44 million. So the Hindu sort of right-wing or the Hindu fundamentalist wanted those 44 million people under the accounting head of Hindu, which was when this whole campaign against untouchability began. How do we maintain the caste system, but how do we bring them into the big house, but keep them in the servants' quarters? So this was really the idea behind it. And it was very interesting because even today you have the big debate between secularists and the right wing now about the past and about how Islam desecrated temples and destroyed idols and murdered people, and the secularists trying to minimize that. Whereas, say, someone like Jyotiba Phule, he says, thank God they did. Thank God they destroyed the temples, and thank God they invited us to dine with them. Thank God they invited us to be equals with them. So this just puts a completely different spin on the debate about these things anyway. But of course, while this was happening, there was another more lethal mix, which was that the British, who had given themselves the sort of imperial mandate to rule over all these people, suddenly began to ask these very mischievous questions. I mean, coming from them, it was pretty mischievous. But then, even mischievous questions had to have answers, how does the Congress, which is only privileged caste Brahmin Hindus, claim to represent the Muslims, the Hindus, the Sikhs, and so on. And Ambedkar, in Annihilation of Caste, writes about the fact that before the Mughals came, the people who call themselves Hindus today would never call themselves Hindus. They only referred to themselves in their caste name. You know, that was what was forefronted. And it was the Mughals who called them Hindus, the people who live east of the Indus. The British called them Hindus. But Hindus never called themselves Hindus until this whole anxiety about demography started. And then you began to hear about Hindus not as a religion, but as a race, the Hindu nation, and then Hindutva, which was the phrase coined by V.D. Savarkar, who's a great icon of the Hindu right now, and who was also one of the accused in the assassination of Gandhi. So here you had this whole mix of who represents whom, who can claim to be a leader. You know, as the Indian nation was marked out, it began the struggle against the British Empire. The British actually drew the map, and then the map began to fight back and to disintegrate as it fought back. And so who was the person that stepped into the breach to say that I, in my own person, represent everybody? That person was Mahatma Gandhi. So I began to, reading all these very disturbing things about caste and the things he had said. I just began to wonder, how was he called a Mahatma? Who called him a Mahatma, and what had he done? When was he first called a Mahatma? And it turned out that he was called a Mahatma in 1915, which is the year that he came back from South Africa. And I began to think, so what did he do in South Africa to earn that title? And then, you go back another 20 years to 1893 when he arrived in South Africa, and the disturbing role that he played there just becomes really, really hard to understand how we could all have been fed on this story. Because his views on race and his views on caste are very intertwined. He arrives in South Africa in 1893, 24 years old, a trained lawyer, as legal advisor to a wealthy Gujarati merchant. Imperial Britain was tightening its grip on the African continent, and Gandhi was jolted into political awakening a few months after he arrived. All of us have been told the story that he was thrown off a whites-only train in Pietermaritzburg, and he was so outraged, and that was the thing that kick-started his political career. The truth is, he was not outraged about racial segregation. He was outraged that Indians, especially passenger Indians, the rich sort of privileged caste Indian businessmen, Muslim businessmen, were categorized along with what he called the raw Kafirs, So he had a problem with that. He did not want Indians, upper caste Indians, to be treated the same way as black Africans. In 1894, he founded the Natal Indian Congress. The membership fee for that was £3, which was so exclusive. I mean, 12 years later, the Zulu Uprising happened because the British imposed a £1 tax. So you can imagine what a £3 tax was. But the first political victory of the Natal Indian Congress came in 1895 with the solution to the problem of the Durban post office. And you know what that was? That was that they fought for a third entrance to be opened to the Durban post office so that Indians and blacks would not have to share the same entrance. So that was the first great victory. In an open letter to the Legislative Assembly, Gandhi says that both Indians and the English, quote, spring from common stock called the Indo-Aryan. And he says that the Indian is being dragged down to the position of the raw Kafir. This is a quote. So there were two kinds of Indians in South Africa, the passenger Indians and the indentured labor, who were mostly subordinate castes, very poor people, almost like slaves. And he always, Gandhi went out of his way to make a difference between the passenger Indians and the indentured Indians. So here I'm quoting what he says about the indentured Indians. Whether they are Hindus or Mohammedans, they are absolutely without any moral or religious instruction worthy of the name. They have not learned enough to educate themselves without any outside help. Placed thus, they are apt to yield to the slightest temptation to tell a lie. After some time, lying with them becomes a habit and a disease. They would lie without any reason, without any prospect of bettering themselves materially, indeed without knowing what they're doing. They reach a stage in life when their moral faculties have completely collapsed owing to neglect. So this was the separation that he made. And then in 1899, he, as we know, collaborated with the British in the Boer War because, diamonds had been discovered, minerals had been discovered. So the British went to war. It was a very, very brutal war. Gandhi actually petitioned the British to allow them to carry arms, but that was turned down, and he ended up just being a stretcher bearer. In fact, there's a book coming out soon called The Stretcher Bearer of Empire, which I recommend that you all read. And so a lot of Indians and Africans were dragooned into the war, but Gandhi actually volunteered. And after the war was over, the British rewarded the Indian and African soldiers with a piece of the Queen's chocolate. And Gandhi actually wrote to them saying, "Can the volunteers have some chocolate too?" And they said no. Then in 1906 came the Bambata Uprising, the Zulu Uprising, and once again, Gandhi collaborated with the British. It was a brutal putting down. Many Zulus were massacred. And Gandhi, he says in his paper, Indian Opinion, "What is our duty during these calamitous times in the colony? It is not for us to say whether the revolt of the Kafirs is justified or not. We are in Natal by virtue of British power. Our very existence depends on it. It is therefore our duty to render whatever help we can." And so he again offers to bear arms. Again, it's turned down. So again, it's the stretcher bearer thing. And only months after that uprising was put down in 1906, the British passed the Transvaal Asiatic Law. Basically, they did not want Indian merchants to go into the Transvaal and compete with them. So it was a way of keeping Indian merchants out. And that is the time when Gandhi came into his own and began the huge protests where people burnt their passes. And Gandhi, the man who could not bear to use the same post office entrance as a black person, was now in prison with, quote unquote, Kafirs. And here is what he says: "We were all prepared for hardships, but not quite for this experience. We could understand not being classed with the whites, but to be placed on the same level with the natives seemed to be too much to put up with. I then felt that Indians had not launched our passive resistance too soon. Here was further proof that the obnoxious law was meant to emasculate Indians. Apart from whether or not this implies degradation, I must say it's rather dangerous. Kafirs, as a rule, are rather uncivilized. The convicts even more so. They are troublesome and dirty and live like animals." And then there became a huge campaign of how Indians must have separate prisons, separate food, separate blankets, separate toilets. And while this agitation was going on, he was also developing the tools of satyagraha on Tolstoy Farm, which is a fruit farm given to him by this German friend of his, Kallenbach. And there he began his experiments with, purity and pollution and semen retention and all of that. And it was an inversion of caste. It was all about pollution and purity. Gandhi always said that he wanted to live like the poorest of the poor. But the question is, can poverty be simulated poverty, after all, is not just a question of having no money or no possessions. It's about having no power. And as a politician, it was Gandhi's business to accumulate power, which he did effectively. Satyagraha wouldn't have worked even as much as it did if it wasn't for his star power. If you are powerful, you can live simply, but you cannot be poor. The irony is that while Gandhi was performing the rituals of poverty in Tolstoy farm, he was not questioning the accumulation of capital or the unequal distribution of wealth. He was not holding out for improved working conditions for the indentured or for the return of land to those it had been stolen from. He was fighting for Indian merchants' rights to expand their business into the Transvaal and compete with British merchants. So this is the 20 years in South Africa. It is only the last year, in 1913, that he steps out to join the worker strikes, the coal miners' strikes, and so on, very quickly compromises with Jan Smuts and leaves South Africa. Many South African Indians question, what authority he had to make a settlement on their behalf. But that's what actually happened. And he left. But meanwhile, Charlie Andrews had arrived and started calling him the living Christ. And on his way back to India, he stops off in London and is awarded the Kaiser-e-Hind, the Imperial British government's highest civilian award for service to empire, right? And then he arrives in India as the Mahatma who fought racism and who fought the empire and so on, greeted on arrival by the Birlas, one of the biggest mill owners in India, and financed by them for the rest of his life. And his son works in the Birla newspaper, Hindustan Times. His ashram is funded by the Birlas. He comes up with this doctrine of trusteeship, where he says the rich man must remain in possession of his wealth, but he must use it as charity, to do good works, like the beginnings of corporate social responsibility. So in some ways, the fact is that he was perhaps the first corporate-sponsored NGO, the beginning of that. And then the mill owners are asking, there's worker trouble happening. The mill owners have made a lot of money during the war, but there are lightning strikes and so on. Gandhi comes in to negotiate. He actually forms these kind of worker organizations where he refuses to allow workers to represent themselves. He says, only I will represent you. And if you see the writing about workers, again, it's like the writing about the indentured, the writing about Africans in South Africa. So the Mahatma who promoted homespun khadi and the wooden charkha was sponsored by a mill owner. The man who raged against the machine was kept afloat by industrialists. It was the precursor to the phenomenon of the corporate-sponsored NGO. But by then, now you're coming up to around 1921 with the first non-corporation movement. And meanwhile, abroad, perhaps because of the violence of the war, Gandhi is being valorized as Christ, actually, in the community church in New York, in a sermon called Who is the Greatest Man in the World? The Unitarian minister John Haynes Holmes introduces Gandhi as the suffering Christ of the 20th century. Later, Martin Luther King says Christ furnished the spirit, while Gandhi furnished the method. And they present Gandhi with this whole new constituency of African Americans, which is a paradoxical gift for a man who despised Africans. Everyone seems to have forgotten that Jesus was a carpenter from the slums of Jerusalem who challenged the Roman Empire. He didn't collude with it, and he wasn't backed by big business. So this was the saint who Dr. Ambedkar, born on the 14th of April, 1891, into an untouchable Mahar family, presumed to argue with. It was a fascinating conflict. And obviously, I can't, tell you all the details. But to begin with, Ambedkar didn't have to go all the way to South Africa to experience outrage at discrimination. He went to a school, I mean, thanks to British legislation, he was allowed to go to a school where he was made to sit on a gunny sack in the corner of the classroom because he would pollute his other classmates in this little town called Satarad, which is where he grew up. And then the family moved to Bombay in 1897, and Ambedkar was an excellent student and won a scholarship from an anti-Brahmin campaigner, the Maharaja of Baroda, to go to Columbia to study economics. And so in 1913, when Gandhi comes back to India, Ambedkar is going to Columbia. And the remarkable thing is that while Gandhi's shedding his Western suit for a loincloth, Ambedkar, who was actually meant to only wear loincloths, is putting on a suit and going to Columbia. And which was the more radical of these two acts, is up for questions. And it was there that Ambedkar, at the age of 25, wrote this brilliant paper called Castes in India, Their Mechanism, Genesis, and Development, in which he argued that caste could not be equated with either race or class, but was a unique social category in itself, an enclosed, endogamous class. And then he studied economics, then he came to London, to LSE, and then at the Gray's Inn, he became a lawyer. And in 1917, Ambedkar returns to Baroda, where, in order to repay his scholarship, he goes to work in the Maharaja's offices. And he's not greeted by any industrialists, of course, but by the thorny embrace of the caste system, where the clerks roll up the carpet so that he doesn't pollute the carpet as he walks in. They throw the files at him so that they don't pollute themselves by touching it. He looks for accommodation and finds none. No Hindu, no Muslim, no Parsi will allow him to stay or give him rooms. He just can't survive in Baroda, so he returns to Bombay. And this is now 1917, when this whole anxiety about demography I was talking about is at its peak. And the Congress has passed its anti-untouchability manifesto, but he knows, Ambedkar knows, Annie Besant, one of the founders of the Congress Party, has written the most despicable things about caste just a few years earlier. So Ambedkar sort of sees through this maneuvering as a way of trying to control people. And he realizes that the only way out of this quagmire is to develop a way in which Dalits could form a political constituency of their own, a representation of their own. And he begins to develop the ideas of representation. Because Ambedkar believed it wasn't just the stigma, the purity and pollution around untouchability, but caste itself that had to be dismantled. The practice of untouchability, cruel as it was, the broom tied to the waist, the pot hung around the neck, were the performative, ritualistic end of the practice of caste. The real violence was the denial of entitlement to land, to wealth, to knowledge, to equal opportunity. How can such a system of immutable hierarchy be maintained? How do landlords force laborers, generation after generation, to toil night and day on subsistence wages? Why would an untouchable laborer who's not allowed to even dream of being a landowner one day put his or her life at risk at the landlord's disposal to plow the land, sow the seed, and harvest the crop, if it were not out of the sheer terror of punishment that awaits the wayward? How were African slaves forced to work on American cotton fields? By being flogged, lynched, hung from trees for others to be afraid. Why are the murders of insubordinate Dalits even today never simply murders but ritual slaughter? Why are they always burned alive, raped, dismembered, and paraded naked? So when people sometimes fear this critique of Gandhi because they think, oh, it's a critique of nonviolence itself. No. But the real question I have is, how does Gandhi's doctrine of nonviolence What does it mean for it to be founded on a bedrock of such egregious violence? What is that nonviolence that accepts this systemic, continuous terrorization of other people? So in order to detach caste from the political economy, from conditions of enslavement in which most Dalits lived and worked, and in order to elide the questions of entitlement, land reform, and the redistribution of wealth, Hindu reformers cleverly narrowed the question of caste to the issue of untouchability, and they framed it as an erroneous cultural practice that needed to be reformed. Gandhi narrowed it even further to the issue of bhangis. Bhangis is the word he would use for manual scavengers, the people who actually have to clean shit with their other people's shit with their bare hands. And he seized upon the bhangis, who are today called Balmikis, and made them his show window for untouchability. Upon them he performed his missionary acts of goodness and charity, and he preached to them how they should love and hold on to their heritage. In 1925, he says, I quote, "If at all I seek any position, it is that of the bhangi. Cleaning of dirt is sacred work which can be done by a Brahmin as well as a bhangi, the former doing it with and the latter without the knowledge of His Holiness." So the Brahmin must clean the soul and the bhangi must clean the body. And the question is, other cultures all over the world have dealt with the issue of disposing shit without making such a song and dance about it. Please. So, witness to all of this, Ambedkar realized that the problem of caste would only be further entrenched unless they were able to formulate a way in which to represent themselves. And this is what he began to work on. Now, all of us have heard of the Great Salt Satyagraha, right? In 1930, when Gandhi led thousands of people to the sea to make salt and break the British salt tax laws. That was an incredible piece of political theater. I'm a fan of the salt satyagraha, but what none of us, or very few of us, know is that 3 years before that, Ambedkar led the Mahat Satyagraha, where he led 10,000 untouchables through the town of Mahad to drink water at a public tank. They were, of course, beaten and dispersed, and then the Brahmins purified the tank by pouring cow dung into it. But Gandhi never supported that, water satyagraha, never supported it. And that same year, in a speech, he said that he urged Dalits not to do satyagraha. He said, when you do it, it becomes duragraha, which is the devil's force. You should just use sweet persuasion. And so between salt and water, we have this huge toxic universe and huge silences. Then what I can't, of course, get into here because there isn't time is Ambedkar's very unfortunate experiences with the communists. You would have imagined that he would drift to the left movement, which had just started. The Indian Communist Party had been set up in 1925. But sadly, the Communist Party, maybe because they were people of the book, all the leaders were mostly Brahmins. And so, there was a big mill worker strike where Ambedkar and this, one of the main ideologues of the Communist Party, Dange, were organizing together. And Ambedkar said that in the mills, Dalits are only allowed to work in the spinning department, the lower paid spinning department, because in the weaving department, you have to keep the thread in the mouth, and that, they say, will pollute the textile. But shouldn't we first talk about equality between the workers? And this proposal of his was turned down, which is why it set up a terrible rift between Ambedkar and the left, which goes on till today. And Ambedkar said that, caste is not just a division of laborers, but it's not just a division of labor, but a division of laborers. And the first major confrontation, face-to-face, between Ambedkar and Gandhi happened here in London in 1931 at the second Roundtable Conference. The first conference had been boycotted by the Congress Party and Gandhi, But Ambedkar and other people who had been invited had developed a very, they had been called to develop a constitution for self-rule. And the untouchable, I'm using this word untouchable because he uses it, and he developed a very interesting way of making Dalits a political community. Because, see, they are just scattered on the edges of villages. So geographically, they can never form a constituency. So he said they should have their own representation, and then they should also vote in the main election. So they had a double vote that would last for 20 years until they developed themselves into a constituency. And when Gandhi arrived at the second roundtable conference, he was infuriated by this. He said the Muslims can have it, the Sikhs can have it, the Christians can have it, but the untouchables will not have it. He said, in my body, in my person, I represent the untouchables. And when he first met Ambedkar, he thought this was some arrogant young Brahmin, And he sort of questioned him about why was he criticizing the Congress, which amounted to a criticism of the homeland. And Ambedkar gave a very poignant reply, and he said, Gandhiji, I have no homeland. No untouchable worth the name would be proud of this land. But there were many debates. It was a raging fight in 1931, and Gandhi finally just threatened them. He said, if you grant the untouchable people a separate constituency, I will fight it with my life. And having delivered this threat, he returned by boat. On the way, he dropped in on Mussolini and then went back home. He did. He said he was very pleased with Mussolini. He said he was doing good work. And then a year later, Ramsay MacDonald awarded the Communal Award, and they actually did agree to Ambedkar's proposal of having a separate constituency for Dalits. Gandhi's response to this was to go on an indefinite hunger strike in the Yerawada prison where he was in jail at that moment. And he began his fast from the prison. The country spun like a top. Public statements were issued, petitions signed, prayers offered, meetings held, and it was a preposterous situation. Privileged caste Hindus who segregated themselves from untouchables in every possible way, who deemed them unworthy of human association, who shunned their very touch, who wanted separate food, water, schools, roads, temples, and wells, now said India would be balkanized if untouchables had a separate electorate. And Gandhi, who believed so fervently and so vocally in a system that upheld that separation, was starving himself to death to deny untouchables a separate electorate. And Ambedkar believed that this was the core of things, that people had to be able to represent themselves. And Gandhi believed on no account must they be allowed to represent themselves. So the gist of it was that the caste Hindus wanted the power to close the door on untouchables, but on no account could untouchables be given the power to close the door on themselves, because the masters knew that choice was power. As the frenzy mounted, Ambedkar became the villain, the traitor, the man who wanted to divide India, the man who was trying to kill Gandhi. Political heavyweights, Rabindranath Tagore, Nehru, Rajgopalachari, all of them weighed in on Gandhi's side. Lots of untouchable leaders too, because they thought if Gandhi dies, the community will be lynched and burnt and so on. What could Ambedkar do? He tried to hold out, but he didn't stand a chance. And after the first 4 days of this fast, he visited Gandhi in prison and signed the Pune Pact. Now this was a really terrible moment for the Dalit movement, and they continue to pay the price today, And basically what they agreed was that there would be reserved constituencies for Dalits, which means that they would be picked, so it was a sort of, the Uncle Toms would be picked, the suitable candidates, the obedient people would be picked. And interestingly, the people who signed the Pune Pact was Birla, Madan Mohan Malviya, the founder of the Hindu Mahasabha, and Savarkar, the originator of the idea of Hindutva, beloved among the Hindu fascists of today. When he recovered from the trauma, Ambedkar said, there was nothing noble in the fast. It was a vile and wicked act. And yet, perhaps the most widely read biography of Gandhi, of Louis Fisher's, on which the Attenborough film is based, says, the fast could not kill the curse of untouchability, but after the fast, untouchability forfeited public approval. The belief was destroyed. Gandhi's epic fast snapped a long chain that stretched back into antiquity. Gandhi's agony gave vicarious pain to his adorers, who knew they must not kill God's messenger on earth. It was evil to prolong his suffering. It was blessed to save him by being good to those whom he had called the children of God. So it was just completely reversed, the whole thing, And after this, Gandhi starts his campaign where he first gives this patronizing name to untouchables, Harijan. Hari is a male deity in Hinduism, so the people of God that then is infantilized into the children of God. And he starts the temple entry movement, basically trying to pull them back into Hinduism. And Ambedkar, at this point, gets so disgusted. That's when he writes The Annihilation of Caste, where he says, just renounce Hinduism and move on. But obviously, to people who have suffered such brutality, even this missionary activity did appear like balm, So while the saint is looking for a placebo, the doctor is looking for a more, viable way of looking at it. But actually, it really broke the movement in many ways. And, but in 1936, when he published this very erudite, very learned piece, The Annihilation of Caste, Gandhi also wrote an essay, brilliant, 1936. It's called The Ideal Bhangi, The Ideal Scavenger. 1936, he's 68 years old. Huh? The Brahman's duty is to look after the sanitation of the soul. I'm quoting Gandhi. The Bhangi is that of the body of society. And yet our woebegone Indian society has branded the Bhangi a social pariah and set him down at the bottom of the scale. If only we had given due recognition to the status of the Bhangi as equal to the Brahmin, our villages would have looked a picture of cleanliness and order. And then he outlines the practical skills and etiquette of an ideal Bhangi. What qualities should such an honored servant of society exemplify in his person? In my opinion, an ideal Bhangi should have a thorough knowledge of the principles of sanitation. He should know how the right kind of latrine is constructed and the correct way of cleaning it. He should know how to overcome and destroy the odor of excreta and various disinfectants to render them innocuous. He should likewise know the process of converting urine and night soil into manure. But that is not all. My ideal Bhangi would know the quality of night soil and urine and would keep a close watch on these and give timely warning to the individual concerned. And then, he says, but such an ideal Bhangi, while deriving his livelihood from his occupation, would approach it as a sacred duty. In other words, he would not dream of amassing wealth out of it. So not only must you clean other people's shit, but you mustn't amass wealth. Now, 70 years later, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, in his book called Karma Yogi, says this about Valmikis, the Bhangi community. I do not believe they have been doing this job just to sustain their livelihood. Had this been so, they would not have continued with this kind of job for generation after generation. At some point, somebody must have got the enlightenment that it is the Valmiki's duty to work for the happiness of the entire society and the gods, and that they have to do this job bestowed upon them by the gods, and this job should continue as internal spiritual activity for centuries. So, as you know, on Gandhi Jayanti, Gandhi's birthday this year, he was out on the streets, sweeping the streets, doing external cleaning. Well, actually, the streets were already cleaned by the Valmikis, who were then locked into their homes. Then some leaves were scattered around the place, and he swept those leaves away. So Gandhi was alarmed by Ambedkar's talk of renouncing Hinduism, and he, like all privileged caste reformers, very, very worried. So here's a conversation he had with an American evangelist, Dr. John Mott. Why he's telling Dr. Mott that it's wrong to preach Christianity to the Dalits. And I quote, "Would you, Dr. Mott, preach the gospel to a cow? Well, some of these untouchables are worse than cows in their understanding. They can no more distinguish between the relative merits of Islam and Hinduism and Christianity than a cow." So, Gandhi made a great virtue of the fact that he contradicted himself all the time. But the fact is that actually he was very consistent. He was consistent in his views on black Africans, on women, which I haven't even got into, that's a whole universe of its own, on workers, and on caste. And of course now, by the time you're coming up into the 40s, the whole caste identity gets subsumed by the Hindu, Muslim, and the Dalits are now dragooned into being the outlying army in the mayhem of partition. And when partition happened, many Dalits were in Pakistan, and the Pakistan government, in the midst of all the murder and chaos, had them declared as emergency services, because who was going to clean the shit in the land of the pure, but Dalits. So there they were for a long time until Ambedkar managed to get many across. So Ambedkar was disillusioned with Hinduism, with its high priests, its saints, and its politicians. And yet the response to temple entry taught him how much people long to belong to a spiritual community. So on the 14th of October 1956, in front of thousands of people, he basically converted to Buddhism. It marked his departure from Western liberalism and its materialistic vision of a society based on rights that coincided with the rise of modern capitalism. Ambedkar did not have enough money to print his major work on Buddhism, the Buddha and his Dhamma, before he died. He wore suits, yes, but he died in debt. Where does that leave the rest of us in India? Though they call the age we're living through the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness, Varnashram Dharma reigns unchallenged. The Brahmin largely controls knowledge. The Vaishya, the Baniya, dominates trade. The Kshatriyas have seen better days, but are still, for the most part, rural landowners. The Shudras live in the basement of the big house and keep intruders at bay. And the Adivasis, the tribal people, are fighting for their very survival. And the Dalits, well, we've been through all that. Can caste be annihilated? Not unless we show the courage to rearrange the stars in our firmament. Not unless those who call themselves revolutionary develop a radical critique of the caste system. And not unless those who understand caste sharpen their critique of capitalism. And not unless we read Baba Saheb Ambedkar, if not inside our classrooms, then outside of them. And until then, we will remain what he called the Sikh men and women of Hindustan, who seem to have no desire to get well. Thank you.
Magnificent, but disturbing. The age of knowledge or the age of darkness. We now have time for discussion, and As we always do, we have microphones being taken around the audience by our colleagues from UCL. And please put your hand up and we will take a group of comments first. Please say who you are and where you're from. I can see somebody with their hand up there. You're going to have to wave at me so I can see you there. Yep, wave, and then the microphone will find you. We'll take 3 or 4 comments together.
Well, this is a comment and a question. Hi, I'm Ina. I'm at UCL, and prior to that, I was a student at JNU, a public health student. Just last week, Arundhati, you must be aware that there was a mass...
I can't see you. Where are you? Oh, okay.
There was a tubectomy camp in Chhattisgarh where 83 women died, and the operations were conducted in less than 5 hours with several injured, while at the same time the government of India was propagating an advertisement where they were encouraging the Parsi community to procreate. My question to you is, how far have we come in this intersection of gender, politics of eugenics, and caste, where we are controlling the women's wombs, where in the name of public health, one of the biggest sponsors of family planning programs in India is DFID, British Funding Agency.
Yes, of course, please.
So I think it's interesting, you know, that in 1977, when the Indira Gandhi declared an emergency, they had a big sterilization campaign, but it was the sterilization of men, and it kind of blew up in the face of the government. So I think now they are going after women, and if you see what the incentives they are offering, you know, it was some eggs and bread and, you know, just trying to kind of prey on this absolutely abject poverty. And apart from the sterilization that went wrong and the terrible tragedy of that, what about the fact that more than 1 million female fetuses are aborted? You know, little girls are aborted before they're born. Many girls are killed just after they're born by their own parents. So this is the thing. I mean, you know, people like to sensationalize. Everybody just, you know, almost every journalist who passes through Delhi wants me to speak on the status of women in India, and I keep saying which woman, you know. I mean, it's such a you know, a society which lives in several centuries simultaneously. So you have the most empowered and liberated women, and then you have this. And obviously, this desperation and powerlessness does have to do with how economic policies are being pushed. You know, you have thousands of people in jail in Chhattisgarh and Orissa and Jharkhand. You have policies which can only be implemented if the paramilitary is out there, you know, raping and burning and emptying villages. So you know, I mean, I sometimes am thought of as the person who brings the bad news about India. But let me say that the good news is that for years, for 15, 20 years now, I have been, you know, at the heart of resistance movements where there's such a tremendous understanding in that country of what these policies are and what they do and what they mean. You know, sometimes it's just a holding operation. They're not winning, but at least they're not just completely flummoxed by what's going on. People have understood.
Question down here on the right.
Hi, my name is Velu. I'm from Indian Workers Association. Thanks for your speeches, Arundhati Roy, and thanks for UCL people. That's my first question. Please say some words about the JNU professors Sai Baba arrested. Number 2, please, how to the caste system to manipulate in the Indian judicial system, please?
In the?
How to caste system to manipulate Indian judicial system, please?
Judiciary. Well, Professor Sai Baba, who he mentions, he's not a JNU professor. He's actually a close friend of mine, and he's in jail right now. He's 90% disabled, lives in a wheelchair, but like he was one of the great mobilizers against what was known as Operation Green Hunt, where basically the paramilitary was deployed in the jungles of central India along with a vigilante force trying to chase tribal people out of their homes because those lands had been signed over to mining corporations and infrastructure companies. And when the Operation Green Hunt was announced, people like Professor Sai Baba were very much at the forefront of mobilizing against it. Now they've put they're trying to put whoever they can among these mobilizers into jail so that the action can happen without announcement. There is a lot of brutality happening in the forests of central India right now. There are something like 200 memorandums of understanding that have been signed, handing over the rivers and forests and all that infrastructure development. Many of those companies who are involved in or at least supporting the killing of people are also sponsoring literary festivals where we all talk about free speech and all of that. That's the new way of doing things. Caste in the judiciary, well, one thing I'll say is that, apart from the fact that what I was talking about, affirmative action or reservation, even though it applies to 2% of the Dalit population, even that is not implemented. But if you see judgment after judgment after judgment, when there is a massacre, whether it's been in the 60s or whether it's now, a massacre of Dalits, and as I said, the massacre is always a performance, it's not that people just get killed, they get locked up, burnt alive, lynched, raped, all of that. And the lower court will come out with a completely unreasoned but ridiculous judgment, which will say, sentence them all to death or something. But the judgment will be written in a way that it can be completely overturned and consistently is overturned. So no one ever gets held guilty. It's far more dangerous in India to kill one person than to kill 200 people, It's better to kill a lot of people, then you always get away.
There's a question up there. Yes, hold your hand up so the microphone will come to you. That's it. Keep holding. It's coming. Great.
Hi. I want to...
Just say who you are so we know.
Oh, my name is Kavita Banot, and I'm studying at Manchester University. You say in your introduction that caste can't be annihilated unless those who call themselves revolutionary develop a radical critique of Brahminism. And what I've seen, because I've been following closely after the publication of your book, on sites such as Dalit Camera or Roundtable, there's been very important, nuanced critique that Dalits themselves have been making, which it has seemed to me that actually your book has perpetuated that kind of casteism amongst leftists in silencing those voices. They're dismissed as social Dalits, but as you point out, that if the media is dominated by upper castes, that's the only voice in which you have to, the only space you have to articulate your critique. Perhaps they are the modern day Ambedkars who are not being given a space to represent themselves and to give a voice to their own struggles. And just following the kind of defense around you seems to me to have actually just been they've been dismissed as essentialist, doing identity politics. It's actually just been a silencing again of their voices.
Okay.
In a way that actually continues upper caste.
Okay. Yeah, well, there has been, the Dalit movement and the Dalit community is a very fractured community. And as I said, there was a very sharp critique of my introduction and this book that came from certain Dalit quarters, which basically said that, unless you're a Dalit, you should not be writing about Ambedkar, you know. But then there are other Dalit groups which have totally welcomed it, you know. So you can't, I mean, you can't just settle on one thing and say, oh, this is it, you know. And the debates have been there. How have they been silenced? Not at all, you know. And I think it's a healthy and important debate, and it should take place, definitely. And yet, at the same time, I think if you, for example, read, like the publisher, the Indian publisher of this book, has spent many years annotating the text, and the annotations really open up the text. You know, because Ambedkar, for example, was somebody who knew Sanskrit. So he writes a lot of Sanskrit shlokas without translating them, and he has so many historical references which nobody knew what they were, you know, until you have an annotated version.
There was a question, yes. Keep your hand up and the microphone will find you. Great. Thank you.
Hey Arundhati, my name's Iram. I'm not a student, I'm just a fan. You gave an amazing lecture about the history of the caste system and a terrible and dark history. Just wondering if you could say something about the future of the caste system and where you think it's going?
Something about what?
The future of the caste system and where you think it's going to go? What would say migration and globalization, where do you think it's going?
Well, I mean, migration, I think you'll find that here in England, Indians have imported the caste system and they practice it, and there is, you know, pending British legislation which isn't getting passed about it, you know. So I mean, really, I don't know how I can answer that question because it's such a deeply ingrained practice. And the only thing I can think of is that there does need to be a light shone on it, and the people who practice it need to be shamed, you know. But
Okay. There are lots of people who want to ask questions. It's 7 o'clock, but forget about the reception. There's a man down here. Yeah, keep waving.
Thanks. I'm Barnaby Dye from the University of Oxford, and I'm interested in sort of dam building, and particularly dam building by Indians in Africa. And I know, obviously, your work on the Narmada movement, and so I wanted to ask you how much you think the continuing sort of culture of dam building in India is related to sort of the caste dynamic, and how much it's to do with the sort of modernist ideas of the state. And especially in terms of the impacts that the dam building has tended to have in terms of sort of displacement and the injustice involved in that. How much is that to do with caste, or how much is that to do with the sort of government ideology of modernity and industrialization?
dam building, oh. Well, see, this is a very actually interesting issue, because, you know, I didn't expand on this. But there, I have written about it in the text of how while Gandhi was a traditionalist, of course, you know, he was supported by industrialists, and when those industrialists were building dams, he supported those dams. But Ambedkar actually believed in modernization, in urbanization, in dam building, and so on. But at that time, to believe in it was different from believing in it now, because you didn't know the consequences, you know, then. And if you look at, I mean, I've written at length about the movement in the Narmada Valley, and what happens is that you know, when they build dams, they make a cost benefit, but then they hide the costs, right? They don't, for example, put in the costs of drainage, which is much more than the cost of irrigation. They don't tell you exactly how many people are being affected. So they reduce those numbers. And then they, For example, they say in their policy, which they never implement, that people will get land for land, but Dalits don't have land. So they don't even count as project-affected people. So they get invisibilized in a way where even, often, even the radical discourse in India today, the radical movements, including the Maoist movement, the anti-dam movements, are all about displacement. But the fact is that automatically means they're about people who have land. So the landless are left out of even the radical discourse, which is a great tragedy.
There's a woman just there. Yeah, you've had your hand up for a little bit. I'm only going to take another couple, I'm afraid, because I'll finish at 10 past. Yeah, keep waving, keep waving. Yeah, there.
Hi, I'm Sham, also just another fan. First of all, I wanted to thank you for highlighting the deep arrogance and hypocrisy of Gandhi, because I've never been a fan. And and I think it's important to highlight that he's been painted as such a patron and a saint, because in India he can be used as an example to continue to institutionalize a deep systematic oppression. And in the West they have this, saint for pacifization that they can use as, turn the other cheek if we're oppressing you, basically. But my question is, given that it's such an internalized concept within many Indians, what are the best steps to take to remove such a long and historic caste system? Thanks.
Okay. To remove what was the last thing you said?
Considering it's such a deep internalized concept in many Indians, even the untouchables, they feel like they shouldn't be touched, etc. What are the best steps to take to remove such a deep concept?
Well, see, the thing is that it's not, it's true that Gandhi, I'm not the first person to critique Gandhi, the left has had a critique of it, Ambedkarites have had a critique, but the thing is, when you put all these separate compartments together, the picture that emerges is a bit shocking. But I think, we just have to learn to complicate the ways in which we look at things. It's about time. For example, I just want to say that, when people talk about nonviolent resistance, and of course, the people who like to talk about it best are the states or the establishment, And a couple of years ago, I had gone into the forest and spent time with the Maoist guerrillas and local people, in this battle against the corporations and the mining. And in the television studios, they were all screaming about non-violence and violence and so on. And I said, look, you tell me, if you're an Adivasi or tribal person living in a village 4 days march from the main road, and 1,000 or 800 paramilitaries surround the village and start burning it and raping the women, what form of non-violence do you advocate? It needs an audience. These people don't have an audience. You can't go on a hunger strike if you're already starving, So there's a certain, at some point it becomes immoral to preach to other people, what to do. And while academics or journalists or writers or students debate the ideology behind nonviolence or armed struggle and so on, quite often ordinary people just kind of cross those boundaries, like illegal immigrants. They're like, we'll be a Gandhian on the street and a Maoist in the forest, or whatever. It depends on the landscape. You cannot run a non-violent agitation in the middle of the forest where you're under attack like that. Similarly, you can't have an armed struggle outside, where it's just not sustainable, So it's a question of tactics. And I think, I think Gandhi is the saint of the status quo, because he is somebody people invoke in order that things don't change. He's a safety valve. And so we'll have to, many people will have to start taking another look at what went on.
I'm going to take two very brief final questions. You, with the blue UCL T-shirt, who've been waving. There's thousands of blue UCL T-shirts, but there's one. And then down here in the second row.
Hi, I'm Priyanka Goyal. I'm a student at UCL in Global Health Program. You see all the blue T-shirts here. I'm very impressed. Let me thank you first. And this is the first time I've heard you speak. And I'm very impressed to speak and hear about the courage you exhibited to talk about anti-Gandhi. It makes me wonder. It's just a comment here. No strings attached. This makes me wonder, this would issue you a fatwa if India were an Islamic state.
What? A fatwa. You mean I might drive the Gandhians to violence?
Just a comment.
There's a question down here on the second row.
Hi there. My name's Pam Das. I'm an editor at The Lancet. In fact, I'm a Bengali editor at The Lancet, so I'm very proud to be here. I'm a big admirer of your work, and I loved your talk today. It was very illuminating, and so I want to bring things back to what's happening today. So currently this week, there's a ministerial meeting happening in Asia, a conference on advancing gender equality and women's empowerment. And in the declarations that are being formulated at the moment, India did quite a sudden thing by changing the wording of their declaration by replacing the word caste with social origins. And I just wondered what you thought. One, are they the same thing? And two, going to the question of you saying that India is not going to be able to annihilate caste, so is it just trying to make it more palatable by calling it something different?
Yes, it is, and the simple answer is that. But, the thing is, it's something which they are, if you come to India just before an election, you'll see the television studios are so vocal about, who's representing the Gujars, who's representing the Yadavs, will the Nairs vote go to the communists this time? The caste issue is just forefronted. And the minute elections are over, it sort of just sinks back into the lake, And the last caste-based census that happened in India was 1931. And now they're trying to avoid that happening. So you invisibilize a lot of stuff that's going on, So, yeah, there's a whole, on everything. The first, I don't think I'm saying this just because I'm a writer, but the first heist is the language heist. The first thing they steal is a language in which you can describe what's happening to you.
It's time to draw the discussion to a close. I'm very sorry. I'd like to thank all my friends and colleagues at UCL. In particular, I'd like to thank Michael Arthur for his support of this this evening. I'd like to thank the team in blue T-shirts who've made this happen. I'd like to thank you for coming. But most of all, I'd like to thank Arundhati Roy.